Good morning. I'm Jim Perkins, and I welcome you to the second presentation of the Spring 2014 OLLI program series, Foreign Cultures and American Foreign Policy. I wish to thank our videographer, Jim Peterson, for all the hard work recording and editing and publishing the videos for this Spring 2014 series and for the past 2 years as well. And I want to thank my wife, Morgan, sitting down here in front, for all of her support and work helping set up the stage, for listening to all my preparations and discussions, and for her suggestions that have helped make this a very successful program series. The objective of the OLLI program is to inform participants about foreign cultures and how they affect those countries' behavior and how that knowledge can create an enlightened American foreign policy. We should strive to follow Jefferson in pronouncing the primacy of an American example, not intending democratization to be an instrument of American foreign policy. Jefferson's belief in the primacy of the American example had an impact on practice. He believed that the people must be prepared to receive democratic values on their own initiative and in their own time. Jefferson realized after the Louisiana Purchase, for example, that the new state was not ready for democracy, as it had no public education and its political culture had been so imbued with Spanish feudalism and Roman Catholicism that its people would not be able to contemplate individual rights and the rule of law, let alone accept such modern values and abide by them in action. The American example is the principle that we must perceive the multiple elements in every society, consider the conditions, and plan accordingly. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said it very well on November the 30th, 2000. Cultural factors are utterly inseparable from foreign policy, and the more we know and understand about the cultures of those with whom we interact, the more successful our policy will be. It is with these principles in mind that we present these talks in this program, Foreign Cultures and American Foreign Policy. Professor David Jordan's experience and expertise is in comparative politics. His field is comparative government in Latin America and international relations and foreign policies in Latin America. To understand where Professor Jordan is coming from, I'd like to share what I know about his background. He is the son of a physician. David Jordan lived in several places growing up, and his father was interested in Mexico and went there to complete a book he was writing. As a teenager, David learned about Mexico and its culture from the street level, and from that grew an interest in this land, its people, and Latin America. David went to Harvard and got his undergraduate degree there. His physician father wanted David to follow in his footsteps as a doctor. And so, as a normal son, David chose to go to law school. His father was here at the UVA School of Medicine, so David attended UVA Law School. But his reputation as a scholar and interest in and knowledge of Latin America and comparative politics drew the attention of people at the University of Pennsylvania. He was invited to come to Penn and was awarded a one-year grant to Argentina as part of his doctoral program at Penn. And it was there in Argentina that he met his wife, who's with him here today. Welcome, Annabella. David came to the University of Virginia as an associate professor in 1965 and received tenure. And during the Vietnam protest movement era, which many of you may recall, in 1969, he was appointed as chair of the Department of Government and Foreign Affairs. At the young age of 33, he was the youngest chair ever of this department, and this was the predecessor of the current Department of Politics. He served as department chair until 1978, when he retired as professor emeritus, and later President Reagan appointed him as the U.S. ambassador to Peru during the period 1984-1986. David is the author of World Politics in Our Time, Nationalism in Contemporary Latin America, Revolutionary Cuba and the End of the Cold War, and the book Drug Politics, Dirty Money and Democracies, about international and security affairs. He will speak on Mexico today. Professor Jordan has indicated that Chapter 19 in his book Revolutionary Cuba and the End of the Cold War has specific information on Mexican and Cuban narcotics activities. And if anybody wants these references, I can get them out by email later. His other book, Drug Politics, Dirty Money and Democracies, also contains references to Mexico and has a very interesting description, which is as follows. Drug Politics is an enlightening new book by a man who knows this disturbing and dangerous subject. A former United States ambassador to Peru, David C. Jordan, has testified before the U.S. Senate and House Foreign Relations Committees and has consulted with various government security organizations. His account of government protection of the criminal elements, intertwined with local and global politics, challenges many of the assumptions of current drug policies. Using examples from South America, Mexico, Russia, and the United States, Jordan shows that the narcotics problem is not supply and demand. Jordan argues that many national and international financial systems are dependent on cash from money laundering, and some governments are far more involved in protecting than in combating criminal cartels. Since the 1990s, he's been lecturing, consulting, and holding conferences in China, Japan, and the U.S. on China, U.S., Latin American, and Asian relations. All the conferences have included Japan and Trans-Pacific multi-state relations, and this is an area hugely important for our future. It is an honor and a privilege to have as our guest today Professor David C. Jordan. David?
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. I would like to start actually by asking a couple of questions. First, do I have any number of people here who have visited Mexico? I'd like to see how many have visited. How many of you have lived there? Where did you live? Mexico City. Do I have any? Yes. Where? Mexico City. Okay. Part of what I thought would be interesting is if I have numbers of people who visited and who may have lived there, to use their experience in part in our discussions later to involve them if we can. Now, one of the first things I'd like to tell you is that I share Winston Churchill's concern about giving a short talk. Much of what I wanted to cover today, I would cover at least in 3 lectures and then have a discussion session afterwards. And so now I was forced, with Jim's request, to figure out how I was going to boil down what I think would be some of the important cultural and historical influences in Mexico and how they relate to current problems. And so you'll have to forgive me. The way I thought I'd do it is divide it in 3 parts. The first would be the several centuries, which will be the shortest, from the conquest of Mexico to the revolution, internal revolution of 1910. Then a somewhat longer, but also shorter in terms of my general presentation, of the development of the monopoly party system in Mexico from the revolution to 1980. And then third, which will be the longer part of my presentation today, to talk to you about the issues of Mexico's movement towards electoral democracy. You can sort of date with the beginning, we'll see, with the massacre of Tlatelolco in 1968 through to the contemporary period. And then ask and have you think about with me one of the favorite issues of politics and discussions that involves American foreign policy and the internal changes in countries. One of the things the United States has started to operate on probably in the 1980s was the idea that democracy, if you democratize countries, there would be a paradigm change. That is, the country could be changed and transformed, and things would be much better. Part of this issue arose over the view that the United States had been, during the Cold War, backing for too long the authoritarian governments in Latin America in resistance to the communist insurgencies there, and therefore there had been brutalities on the part of the military that the U.S. would be backing, as well as the insurgents. So democracy was seen, or democratization, was seen in terms of U.S. foreign policy as addressing the errors of the United States backing authoritarian regimes, and that democratization would fundamentally change the problems and the issues and dilemmas that existed in various Latin American countries could be improved. All right. Let me start by talking about the conquest of Mexico. One of the most interesting books I first read, actually before I went to Mexico with my parents, my mother had me read Bernal Diaz's Conquest of Mexico. He was a man who had been actually, took part was part of Cortez's military force that conquered the country. But one of the most interesting books that I read, besides Bernal Diaz's, was a book that started out with the nature of the Spanish military. And that what you had when you began the conquest of Latin America, the Spaniards had been fighting for centuries, 7 centuries, the Muslim invasion of Spain. And it pointed out that you had one of the most incredibly warlike militaries that had ever been created on the face of the earth when you talked about the Spanish military. They had been fighting and conquering almost ceaselessly since the 8th century. And in the context of this, you also had, and it's one of the interesting things to be looking at for Americans who are now confronting also the issues of Islam, the perspective that the church had with respect to fighting this kind of war with Islam. Now, what happened when this military got to Latin America? They were imbued with an incredible warlike spirit. And you get one of the most important sort of blowbacks on this was that they began with an incredible massacres of the Indian populations in Hispaniola, that's now the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and Cuba, against very docile Indian populations. And part that was justified on the basis that these populations were subhuman. The defense of the Indians was the most famous one, was done by Bartolomé Las Casas. And Las Casas wrote about the error of the Spanish conquista, because he said when they were fighting the Islamic invasion, they were defending their people, but they were not doing this when they attacked the Indians. They were conquerors and imposing themselves upon them. And this becomes the source of what is known sometimes as the Black Legend with respect to the Spanish conquest of the Americas. And the Indians, particularly in the Caribbean region, were very docile. He talked about in his famous writings to to prevent this, and his pleas to the monarchy in Spain to restrain the European attack on the people. Now, probably the most famous of the conquistas by the Spaniards, of course, was of Mexico. And when Cortez went there, stop and think about this. It was dealing with a population of Indians in Mexico of about 10 million. He landed with 600 men and 16 horses. Proceeded to burn the boats that brought him there so that they couldn't go back. You know, no sort of massive areas for American food, and we go out into the Middle East. We have to build, obviously, major supply supports and all the rest of it. They went and were there with 600 men and 16 horses. Now, the great advantage that they had, however, was that the Aztec government was a government that was had a dominant empire and controlled a lot of other Indian groups. And what really allowed and provided the base for the conquest of Mexico was the fact that the other Indian groups became available to the Spaniards to help the conquest. There's so many stories that if you spend time, one of the things I like to describe in some detail, if I have the time, is how they escaped. Part of it was when they were in Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec government down there, and it was full of lakes and corridors. And the Indians were trying to capture them rather than kill them because part of this was that they had human sacrifice. The Aztecs did. In any case, this was an extraordinarily violent period, and we have this also with respect to the conquest of Peru and the like. To give you one idea of the nature of the Spanish warrior, Pizarro, who was part of the conquest of Peru, died in a duel fight at 67 with 11 mortal wounds in it. So I hope I'm conveying initially the nature of a culture that is something that is way beyond the ken of Americans. The next thing about it, in this brief period of a little bit of the background before the national independence, is that the justification for the protection of the Indians that Dominicans such as Las Casas was trying to provide was something called the encomienda, where they could get forced labor of the Indians in exchange for the justification that they would be Christianized. And so, but this ended up being actually something that was an exploitation of the population, and there was really massive deaths in Mexico among the Indian populations during the early phases of the colonial period. Jumping ahead now to another sort of key component here. One of the things that you then need to talk briefly about is how independence came about from Spain and the early conflicts in Mexico prior to the Revolution of 1910. Basically, the independence occurred in the context of a European struggle and changes in Europe. What had been going on since the French Revolution in Europe was a growing movement of what was known as a secular liberal movement for independence from the classical Christian monarchies. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the great powers of Europe formed an agreement that they would move together to repress a liberal populist movement, which had, in their opinion, had produced ultimately Napoleon, which had been an incredible threat to all the rest of the monarchies of Europe. So they would agree that they would cooperate together to prevent this from occurring. Spain had had a very limited success with its parliamentary movement, which was known as its Cortes movement. And the Corteses, however, re-emerged there in the 1820s. And you had, as a result of this, a move, basically was the grant of repressing this was given to the French, that they were going to move in and change this. It was in this context that Mexico became independent. Its traditional elites were concerned at the rise of the Cortes, and you had an independent movement under a man named Iturbide, who was who led the independence. So Mexico initially is independent in terms of an imperial, or he becomes an emperor, an imperial leader of the country, in part resisting the implications of a liberal revolution in Mexico. This doesn't last long, and you've probably all heard of Santa Anna, who becomes the strong man putting in place and toppling governments in Mexico. He does it 11 times. He's the guy in charge when we talk about the Alamo, and also is involved in the war with the United States. The war with the United States is another threshold issue here, because it brings about the dismemberment from the Mexican point of view of their country. Roughly 50% of Mexico is lost to the United States in the war of 1847, 46, 47. Now, with that kind of a dismemberment, there also develops in the cultural attitudes, and part of what you're interested in understanding how you're dealing in terms of the cultures of countries and their point of view, a very strong hostility to the United States. Some of the songs you could hear, if you, that gets to for example, the word gringo. The word gringo, which is the pejorative term that Mexicans frequently use for North Americans, is their understanding of American soldiers singing as they were marching down the La Reforma in the capital city of Mexico, "Green grow the rushes, oh." The refrain of, and part of that is how they began to have their pejorative term for Americans, the gringos. And some of their heroes, for example, are the young cadets that leapt to their death from the castle that was under siege, rather than from Chapultepec as the castle, rather than being surrendering. The next phase of my brief history for the background to the contemporary regime, I'm hoping I'm going to be able to leave you all some time to ask me questions, but as you can see, I could go on for several hours on this stuff with each one of these things. For example, it's one of the fascinating stories for understanding American military strategy is the War of Mexico. It's repeated in Korea, and it's repeated again in a deceptive way during the Gulf War. In any case, what happens then as we get to the American Civil War is another major watershed. In the context of the American Civil War, Mexico is again invaded. This time, basically, the French are involved in it and establish the Maximilian dictatorship, while the United States is involved in its civil war of the 1860s. Once the war is over, that is the American Civil War, the United States masses troops on the Mexican border and basically assists the Mexicans in ousting Maximilian from power. And this brings to power the Benito Juarez and again, a strong secular liberal movement in Mexico that continues a theme of hostility to the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. One of the splits that I didn't mention, I should mention to you in the beginning here, is part of the split in understanding the problem of Catholicism in Mexico and in other parts of Latin America, is that although the Spaniards saw themselves as the arm, if you will, the military arm of the church, the Reconquista, etc., there was a division, as you could see from the Las Casas case, between those who were in the monastic orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and later the Jesuits, who saw themselves trying to protect the people, and the fact that it had been permitted to have a quasi-alliance between the hierarchy and the authority of the state. So there's an ambivalence here that requires you to make some distinctions. That's why, for example, you may have noticed how different Pope Francis is, who the current Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, because he comes out of it. He's a Jesuit, and he also takes the Franciscan name, which shows him as a paladin of the people. And everybody is surprised to see someone wanting to use, a beat-up car to go to work or taking public transportation. There is this kind of cultural divisions that a lot of times Americans don't see because they tend to think of the Roman Catholic Church as a monolith, and it isn't. So there's these kinds of divisions I want to sort of have out there in understanding some of the complexities of culture. Okay, I'm going fast here. But the next point of this is there's also now going to be a hostility of the United States because of the war with Mexico. Then with our backing against of the Mexican insurgency against Maximilian, we end up backing also the liberal forces in Mexico. This is one of the things that I found as a boy that was so interesting, that this relationship established a Masonic connection between Mexico and the United States. Part of this was that the anti-Catholicism was related also to the Masonic backing, because Americans in this context were rather substantially anti-Catholic. And Masonry got allied with the forces of liberalism in Mexico. And it led further on to a relationship with the following leaders, and the most important of whom was Porfirio Diaz, who's in power when we get to the next phase of what I'm going to talk about, the 1910 revolution. What this led to, this particular relationship, was a small elite, they were often known as the científicos, around the Porfirio Diaz, who wanted to develop the country and take their benefits. They got their hand, they were especially privileged and took bribes and whatnot, and also opened it up to foreign ownership. I have a whole list of the kinds of things here, but part of my problem is I can't read in this light. But I will tell you briefly some ideas of it that I think is important. How much the capital of the country was foreign owned. It wasn't just Americans, it was also the French. They were very powerful in the banking industry. One of the areas where it's particularly interesting is the enormous control over massive sectors of land by American interests in northern Mexico. We have Hearst interests, for example, controlling more than 6,600,000 acres in the northern parts of Mexico, and another group of interests from California, more than 7 million acres in the north. The railroads, if you were to look at it, that were being built, were built north to south, and not across the country, but north to south to funnel the basic resources. For example, the Guggenheim fortune is based on the mining interests in Mexico. There's a lot of American corporate forces and interests that were linked to taking benefits from Mexico. This included Standard Oil, that had the monopoly of illuminating oil for the region. So there was an enormous amount of American economic interests that were dominant in Mexico. Now, when you get to the phase, the next phase that I'm going to be talking about is how you develop the regime that was in place that ostensibly gets changed in the last 20, 25 years. What happens is there's a problem again of the continuance in power of Porfirio Diaz. And a man named Francisco Madero becomes the leader of an opposition to re-elections, constant re-elections of the same people being re-elected after. And this is the beginning of the revolution. Again, it's organized through the cities and basically through in secret can be done, much of it through the Masonic organizations that are throughout, that exist throughout the different cities of the country, Mexican organizations. The fighting is somewhat inconclusive, but at the end, by the early parts of 1911, Porfirio Diaz flees the country, and Madero seemingly is in charge. Make a long story short, he's basically ousted again by reactionary forces under a man named Huerta, who is able to announce everybody the sad news that he was killed while trying to escape. Then you have, though, the continuation of the revolution. People like Cárdenas, Obregón in the north. The reason you get very strong movements of the northern leadership again is that's a huge area of where there's a substantial foreign presence. There's also the referred to the Zapata. Zapata basically leads the small Indians and peasant communities in the area south of Mexico City. Now, the revolution proceeds for a number of years of fighting, and it ends up that there's struggles between, if you will, capos or leaders such as Carranza, Zapata, etc. Finally, Mexico writes a constitution with Carranza on top of 1917. And that constitution basically establishes a liberal regime dictatorship. It targets, it has in the things targeting the Catholic Church, for example, that it can't own properties, that there can't be teaching in the schools, many things that are, I could go through the list of the provisions that deal with that. It also deals with calling for land reform. It also deals with the issue of the subsoil rights. Traditionally, in the Spanish crown, a person who owned land did not own what was below it, and that was explicitly said that the subsoil rights belonged to the state, which would be, of course, the basis for the expropriation of the foreign-owned mining companies later. It established these sort of basic ground rules. To jump ahead here in terms of the establishment of the system, all of these leaders get killed and assassinated. Carranza is assassinated. Obregon, who succeeds and is assassinated. This gets the next guy who's in charge, a man named Calles, says, attention. He says, this isn't working out very well in terms of the history of the revolution. All these guys are getting whacked before, and particularly in the Obregon case, he was coming back for his second term. And he's killed in the context of something that's known as the Cristero Rebellion. What happened with Calles was that he said, I'm going to enforce the anti-Catholic rules of the Constitution. And this means that all foreign-born priests are to be kicked out. The masses, they can't have public masses. And there's a rebellion from below of the Christian population. It begins probably initially in Jalisco, but it spreads through the country. And the consequence of this is that all kinds of trouble, and so Calles comes up with a system to create a party of the revolution. It's first called the National Party of the Revolution. Later in the late 1930s, 38, it's known as the Mexican Revolutionary Party, and in 46 it becomes the PRI, the Party of the Institutional Revolution. I'm going to just refer to the PRI throughout this. It's one institute, it gets modified, but I won't go into the details of that. Now, what the party does and what this structure is that as a result of this new structure that was put in place in 1929, you have something that they call the dedazo, which means that the outgoing president identifies who the next president is going to be, and miracles of miracles, he's always elected with 90% of the vote, because the party also controls the electoral vote counting machine. And in this system, I called it, there's a sexenio, the 6 year, they have a term for 6 years. And what happens is the current president is at his power in the 3rd year. As you get down to the last 3 years, it begins to diminish. He can accomplish most of what he wants to do those first 3 years. It begins to diminish because there's going to be a dedazo, and the people are beginning to position themselves to be the next, around the next certain to be president. These guys go out of office with an enormous amount of wealth. The system is known as the upward flowing waterfall. That is that the bribes come in and they go up the thing, and the lowest is at the bottom and the highest goes to the top. Now, in this system, we basically would describe it as a corporativist system, and it has a number of key parts. One is, and I wrote this out so I could do it, but since I can't read it, I got to do it all from the memory of what I wrote out. So here we go. The way it worked is, first of all, a sort of socioeconomic benefit system. And this was, payments would go to small agriculture people, to basically they would get most of their money, their payments just before elections. But there would be benefits to labor groups, to agricultural groups. Those would usually be in the region I call it the indigenous or the Mayan. The indigenous is the area south of Mexico City where there's a number of different Indian populations. And then the Mayan, if you go out towards Yucatan, Quintana Roo, you notice that Mexico kind of goes up again out and sort of curves out towards the Caribbean. That's sort of known as the Mayan region. Those areas get benefits that were particularly powerful, which would go to peasant farmers. Then there was the labor groups that got benefits. The biggest one had occurred back in the 30s under Lázaro Cárdenas, who was in many ways one of the biggest heroes of the PRI, in that he's the largest distributor of lands, and he's the person who's behind the nationalization of the foreign-owned oil companies. One of the interesting issues from the point of foreign policy in this is this happens in 38, and the negotiations are going on, and then as the war breaks out, basically the United States pays the Mexican government to pay off the companies they have associated, because we're worried about Mexico's support and cooperation during World War II. Another one of those interesting things that, of course, escaped the public's attention because we were in the war while this is being done. Basically, we did it by buying huge amounts and stockpiling Mexican silver production, things like that, so they would be able to continue to have the funds to pay for the nationalizations. Anyway, Lázaro Cárdenas is a huge sort of figure of the powerful nationalization of the foreign oil companies that had continued to maintain control of subsoil rights. They had done this through the arrangements that Dwight Morrow had, who was our ambassador to Mexico in the late 20s with Calles. It was known as the so-called Bucareli agreements, which basically allowed Americans to keep the control of the subsoil rights if they had been granted under an arrangement that was done, an agreement that was done in 1884. In any case, this system has been known as the perfect dictatorship, because on top of there being the support for the labor unions, payment for labor unions, in fact, in the labor laws of Mexico, one of the ways they could keep control over the labor unions is if a challenge came, the government was able to have him expelled from the union, so that the union bosses always stayed in support of the PRI-regime. A third component, besides the economic benefits arrangements that were done with the unions and the peasant organizations, was with the bank. Well, let me do first the business corporations. Basically, the business corporations were fearful of a expropriation, and so very early on, they learned in this system that if they provided lots of money to the PRI, they wouldn't be expropriated, and the benefit they got back from that was very low taxes. Then there was the banks. Now, the banking system is an extraordinary. Well, I think I'm getting ahead of myself. First, before I do that, let me talk to you about how crony capitalism worked in the context of basic enterprises. The classic example I can give you is probably many of you have heard of Carlos Slim. He's frequently, sometimes he shows up in the Forbes thing. Sometimes he's richer than Gates, and sometimes he's not, but he's always been richer than Warren Buffett. Now, how does that particular form of crony capitalism work? Well, he is the owner of Telemex. Telemex is the monopoly telephone service of Mexico. How did he get it? Well, he gets a deal with, we'll talk about this man in a bit, with Carlos Salinas, who's a president from 88 to 94, and pays off his ownership of Telemex, which is the monopoly phone service of Mexico, probably 80% of the phone lines, out of the earnings that it gets. In other words, he doesn't pay it up front, he pays it off over the course of owning it. In this context, Another thing to notice about this is that, and sometimes you might want to watch it, The Economist has a crony capitalist index. Maybe some of you have seen it. One of the things on that is that Mexico ranks not today, number 7th in the world. It's behind Hong Kong, Russia, Malaysia, Ukraine, Malaysia, and the Philippines. In other words, about how you get benefits in terms of sales, and with government assets, you've had a great status system, and you get in a relation become an oligarch, as you've all heard about Russian oligarchs, Ukrainian oligarchs, etc. Now, the next thing is to get into the problem of the banks. Mexico's banks have all been indicted for money laundering. This includes Bancomer, Banamex, which is the largest, Bancomer, which is the second, Banca Serafin, the third, Bital, the fourth, and Banco Santander, the fifth. And you'll say, but obviously, there's no problem here with the American banks in Mexico. We are, of course, not infected with the Mexican system. Well, I hate to disabuse you of that particular thing, but some of you may have noticed that Wachovia was purchased by Wells Fargo. You noticed that? Well, Wachovia paid $160 million for having laundered nearly $400 billion, $378.4 billion of drug money. It paid a fine for that. It was then purchased by Wells Fargo. And in the context of this, it had also admitted to having moved 22 tons of cocaine from Mexico to the United States. And one of the nice things about that is when Wells Fargo got into trouble in 2008, we gave them $25 billion, so that was good. So the financial system got also involved and brought into the structure of the Mexican system. And now comes the long part. Look how long it's taken me here. Okay, I will try to do this, because this is actually important for both sort of political science-y theory issues and for American population to know what's going on. One of the things was a push, can we make Mexico a competitive democracy and things are going to be fine? Now, the beginnings of the weakening of the Mexicans' perfect dictatorship, as Vargas Llosa has called it, of the pre-party arrangements, begins with the Tlatelolco massacre in 1968, when there's a massive protest against the elements of the corruption, and it's been done basically by students, and many thousands probably of them are killed. The figures are low, but in any case, you begin to get a student movement that becomes part of resistance to the way things are. On top of this, there's the regime reacts, as it usually reacts, by going into its benefit cycle. We're sort of in the sexenios, the 6-year terms. There was sort of a cycle between when they were building the economy up and when they were, the next one when they were being distributing goodies because the tensions had risen because of investments were more directed towards building the country up rather than distributing benefits. So the reaction to this is to provide benefits. The next president that comes after Diaz Ordaz, into which the massacre occurred, is a man named Echeverria, who was his Minister of Interior, who actually ran the repression on the students. And so Echeverria goes this, and the country is able to do more distributions because there's a huge growth in the demand for oil, and the price of oil goes up, and that's a principal Mexican export. Basically, the thing collapses in the early 80s when Reagan basically is moving to confront the Soviets and bring down the cost of petroleum. And the Saudis support us in this, and the cost of petroleum comes down to about $8 a barrel. And it causes a financial collapse in Mexico. The Mexican president at the time, a man named López Portillo, had been telling everybody he was going to defend the peso like a dog, and they'd had a very strong peso, and Mexicans were traveling and visiting the United States, Europe, what have you. But he had to blame somebody for this new collapse of their foreign exchange earnings. And so he blamed the banks and he privatized them. On this basis of the nationalization of the banks, began to lose the payoff arrangement with the business sector. The business sector begins to move against the PRI. In order to try to recover, and by the way, I'll just say that there's a number of there's first of bailouts for Mexico. There was the Baker Plan under Reagan, and there's the Brady Plan under H.W. Bush. And so there's an effort to try to keep this because they're already worried about massive immigration from Mexico into the United States as a result of the collapses of the economy. We begin to get the beginnings of a fissure in the ruling sector of the PRI. A more technocratic group, many of whom have been educated in the United States. You'll start finding these people as being graduates from Harvard, MIT, other Ivy League schools, who begin to be identified as technocrats. And what they're trying to do is try to bring Mexico back on its feet. And so, for example, in the De la Madrid regime, which is the one right after López Portillo, the one from 82 to 88, he makes an agreement with the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade, which begins to open up the economy on trade, which further antagonizes the statist section, which means in the 1988 election, there's an enormous tension within the PRI. The part that is going to try to be more modernized, open up the economy, and the part that says they're going too far. The technocrats are opposed by those who are reacting to it, who are known as the dinosaurs or the dinosaurios. This particular situation leads to a very close election. It's one of the elections, and Carlos Colosio, Salinas is elected barely, and maybe he wasn't. What happens is, as the election is going on, it closes down, the computers stop working, and then when they finally get back working, luckily, he's won with 50.7% of the vote. So things did work out. Of course, that stimulated an investigation. And of course, they were going to go to the records, find the records so that they could, be recounts and all those good things. Unfortunately, it was stored in the 4th floor of the Pemex building, which happened to have a fire. And so it was unfortunately, it was not possible to figure out what had happened in the election. But this has now produced a division. The old guard that want to keep the old Mexican system in place and not this sort of opening process is forms a Frente Nacional with other dissident groups, which was part of its opposing Salinas. The leader of that was Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, the son of this Lázaro Cárdenas I told you, who was a great hero. So it was a close situation. In any case, to rush ahead, the key event that occurs following this with respect to the opening of Mexico is the naming of a man named Donald Luis Colosio to be the successor of Carlos Salinas. Donald Luis Colosio says he's going to, in the future, have conventions. There won't anymore be dedazos. That is, there won't be any more the outgoing guy picking the new guy for the maintenance of the system. He's also asked to sit down with the head of the Gulf cartel. That's the cartel on one of the leaders, the brother of the top leader. He's asked to sit down. He refuses. A few weeks later, he's in Tijuana airport and he is killed. He's assassinated. On the videos, you see actually the guards paving the way for the assassin to get access to him. This is enough of a problem so that the ones that want to keep the system intact are not able to do so. And the campaign manager for Colosio becomes the next candidate, and President, a man named Zedillo. Anyway, to make a short, I know I'm going fast here, but I want to give you some questions, but I think I've got to give you this sense of what we're up against, what's happening. This results that Zedillo wants to fulfill Colosio's agenda. And what had happened under the Salinas regime was they had agreed to a North American free trade agreement. And this is further on developed and confirmed with the Clinton administration when it comes in. Zedillo is going to maintain this arrangement. It leads to a major significant rebellion in the Chiapas from a group of people led by a guy named the Comandante Marcos, who was basically protesting, and it comes to the fore when the NAFTA agreement is to go into place January 1st, 1994. So all of this stuff is getting more and more unsettled, and in this context, Zedillo agrees that there will be an independent electoral board running the elections of Mexico. So it looks as if finally there will be a competitive electoral system and everything will be different. Everything will be changed. It's going to be open, and the paradigm is once you have an open political system, two competing party structures, this corporatist, payoff, crooked elements of the Mexican system will be abolished. So in and in this context, to further show the change that's occurred, there is a accordat drafted with the Vatican. So the Vatican, and we have several visits of John Paul II to Mexico. So things look like it's changing. You've got open markets. You've got a rapprochement with the church. You've got an electoral system in which there is an independent group. It's no longer in the hands of the ruling party. So things ought to get better. The American idea that open markets, competitive elections, competitive primaries, these things are going to be fine. Well, I'm going to just have to give this to you very briefly. In all of this context, the one thing I've neglected to go into detail to you is what has been the role of narcotics in this system. If this is a corporative system of which money goes from below up, would the narcotics system be any different from the financial system, the business system, the union system, and the people who run the public and independent unions? Very briefly, the answer, with respect to the PRI, I can give you a few instances. For example, later you may want me to tell you about the Kiki Camarena case, which was the kidnap, torture, killing of the American DEA agent in Mexico in 1985. But in any case, for example, the house that he was tortured in had been sold by the brother-in-law of President Echeverria to Caro Quintana, one of the top capos of the Guadalajara cartel. Zuno, who was his brother-in-law, is serving a life sentence in a prison in the United States, as this evidence came up that he was involved in the Kiki Camarena. You go through all of this stuff, and you basically see that the PRI had handled the narcotics problem, and there wasn't, before there was a war on narcotics, by what they called plazas. There were the plazas that were allocated to the different cartels. For example, when Colosio was in Tijuana, there was the Tijuana plaza, that is the drug trafficking that goes into Southern California, San Diego. Then you can go and get to Sonora, and you see the plazas that go through Nogales into Arizona. You can move into Texas, and you look at the Laredo, Brownsville, all these plazas get allocated, and that's part of the system of upward flowing money. And this was why there was not a whole lot of wars in Mexico under the PRI, because the deals were going. And Colosio was breaking those arrangements, saying he was going to break those arrangements when he's killed. Now, this isn't going to happen, is it, obviously, when there is an open election and a competitive party finally wins. The PAN, the National Autonomous Party, wins in 2000 with a man named Fox, who actually has been a buddy of the Texas governor, George Bush. And he's from Guanajuato, which is just north of the state of Mexico. Now, in 1993, one of the major guys of the largest cartel, being called the Sinaloa cartel, or the Guadalajara cartel, that's in Jalisco. He was from, but they stretch across the states of Mexico. A major figure in that, a man named El Chapo Guzman, is put in prison in 1993. And he's put in prison in the maximum security prison of El Puente Grande. Maybe some of you heard about his escape. Did anybody hear about his alleged escape in a laundry bag? In the laundry cart? Anybody hear that? You may have heard that, okay. And Chapo Guzman, when does he escape? He escapes in February of 2001, which is a month and a half after Mr. Fox takes office. Interesting, isn't it? He gets out of jail in February of 2001. And he's the head of the Sinaloa cartel. What do we find next? I'll try to do this, but you got to know this, because the whole point of giving you background was to tell you this stuff. The head of the judicial police, one of the things they do is they keep changing the names of the police organizations, so you think it's something different. But each time, it's the same guys, but under a different name. The guy who's head of the judicial police when this occurs is a man named Genaro Garcia Luna. And the journalists who are in hiding in Mexico, the particular one that I think is most interesting is a woman named Anabel Hernandez, and she's in hiding with bodyguards and all the rest, has done probably the best research on this that I know of. In any case, El Chapo Guzman becomes the head of the Sinaloa cartel. And he's authorized and begins to move against the competitive cartels, which are the Tijuana cartel, the Juarez cartel, and the Gulf cartel. The Gulf also ends up having an enforcer group known as the Zetas. Well, basically, the alleged war on drugs, everybody says, oh, we've had a big war on drugs and it's failed. The alleged war on drugs begins with the fact that the judicial police are clearly seen as backing the Sinaloa cartel against the Tijuana cartel, the Gulf cartel, and the Zetas. So there's a strike back at a base of the Sinaloa cartel in Guerrero, which is where Acapulco is, which was a base of the Sinaloa operation. And the roll-up of the Zetas that make this attack is done by the federal police, which then leads to an open announcement coming out of both out of the Gulf Zeta arrangements that there will be war on the government as well as on those in the government who are backing the Sinaloa cartel. So the thing breaks out basically in 2005 of Fox's when there's about 9,000 people are killed before Felipe Calderon gets elected, who is also from the PAN party. Now, the guy who's running this is a man named Garcia Luna, as I told you, who's running the police that are working with basically the enforcement. And the power that Chapo Guzman has is he's deploying against the other cartels that won't cave into them the power of the government. And this accelerates under Felipe Calderon. And what you have on this is the United States thinks it's got a war going, and you may have heard of the Merida Initiative, where the United States starts giving money to the Mexican government because it's a war on drugs. But what is really happening here by those journalists who are following this is really now the PAN is moving in and trying to get the rents that come from elements of the cartel supporting them. In other words, a low tax rate. What is the thing? $30 billion a year you're talking about coming from the drug trade into Mexico when it sails to the United States. Fox, who came in nearly broke, goes out a multi-billionaire and and the reporters have that his bag person is his second wife's son. Then you get Felipe Calderon, and the estimates are 80,000 people are killed in the drug wars, which is the backing of the Sinaloa cartels against the Zetas, the Gulf, and the Tijuanas are out of it, and they form what is known as a federation. They get an alliance with the old Juarez cartel on the Texas borders, and they become the most powerful cartel there. Now, what gives you interesting additional evidence is, remember, Chapo Guzman, all these years, has been number one. We're going to get him number one. Unfortunately, number one, no, they can't get number one during the Fox or the Calderon. Lo and behold, the new president who's from the PRI, Enrique Peña Nieto, he gets him in August. That's it. After a year, they get him. And he also frees Cara Quintero, who had only served 28 years of his 40-year sentence, which brings back the fact, that the PRI is going to have new arrangements with the cartels. The new leader will probably be El Mocho Zambada. Zambada is the guy for the Sinaloa cartel who controls the Mexican International Airport. Okay, let me just leave my last sort of data for you. Is this going to be important for the United States? And should the United States pay any attention to what goes on in Mexico? According to, this is the latest I've had, the 2010 Drug Threat Assessment Report of the US government. Drugs are distributed in the United States by 20,000 street gangs with 900,000 individuals operating in 3,500 US cities. Have any of you looked at if there's any presence of any distributing gangs in Charlottesville, Virginia? Of course there's none. The Sinaloa cartel controls 3,007 legal companies inside and outside of Mexico. U.S. drug consumption has increased 79% between 2007 and 2012. This Sinaloa cartel continues to be the largest producer of heroin in the United States, controlling 1/2 of the North American market. In 2012, the Mexican Army reported it destroyed 36,000 acres of opium poppies, down from 40,000 the year before. Any questions? Yes. I've done this truncated, but if you want more info. No, if they, I know, I said a half an hour, I'm down to 15 minutes. But it's a lot to cover. This is my reliance on Churchill. It's very hard to do a short talk of a lot of stuff.
Well, let's go ahead and give him a round of applause for this very enlightening entertainment. If there are questions, would you please come over here so we can record these since we're doing this for the video. If people have questions, come on over. Please come over here. Thank you. One of the things that you mentioned in one of our conversations is that the United States thinks like, my opinion is that the United States thinks like we're the only player in the game. But there are other countries that are interested in the products, the relationships with Mexico. Would you care to say anything about that?
Well, I'll tell you the one that is interesting. I couldn't cover all this, but one of the things that many of us are concerned about is the terrorist connection, the international terrorist connection to the drug operations. Some of you may have seen the report that there was an assassination attempt that was foiled on the Saudi ambassador to the United States in Washington. That arrangement was done through the Zeta cartel. The Zetas have now split off from the Gulf, run their own arrangement, and they're all former Special Forces Air Mobile trained people from the Mexican Army. And probably the United States did infiltrate that to some degree so that they got the information to head off that particular assassination attempt. But part of the concern is the degree the operations that exist through the networks can be infiltrated with respect to the terrorists. And it's a different type of problem with money laundering because the narcotics money laundering is dirty money to clean. The following of the terrorists is clean money to dirty. The thing that goes through charitable organizations, stuff like this, and then ends up funding the stuff in. So it's become a very, and the key U.S. entity, if you're interested in following it, is to watch the Treasury Departments got the special investigations for how to follow the money in that regard. Anyway, go ahead.
This is perhaps an unfair question, but what can we do as opposed to what should we do? Because they probably are two different things. But with regard to the drug problem, as long as we remain the market, do you have any kind of thing we can do to hurt this? I mean, obviously this is spread in a number of directions. This is, as you point out, not just a matter of who's taking drugs, but also a matter of terrorism and other issues involved with it. But what recommendations might you have?
Well, the first problem, in a way, for the American people to understand is the degree we're financing our problem. Let me just give you one particular example. Everybody might think The farm program is wonderful and has got huge political power behind it. For example, that's because of the distribution of food stamps. But the United States is also funding corporate American agriculture. And under NAFTA, the American export of corn is below the price that small tenant Mexican farmers can sell their local corn crops to the local tortilla people. And so we are accelerating the movement from southern Mexico to their north and to us because they can't make a living. And in that process of going north, one place they can go is to work in the narcotics operations. And so the United States, and then the United States pays additional billions to build a wall so they won't come in while it's dislocating them. Here's the figure. 20% of Mexico has left Mexico. If that were the United States, we'd have lost 60 million people. It's 23 million people have left Mexico out of a population of 110 million. They're not coming here, as Mr. Bush said, because they love it. How many of these people that if you talk to who say, I had to leave my wife, I'm trying to send food back, I'm sending packages back. They're forced out. Most people don't want to leave the land. I've talked to many people who tell me about how I used to go, a gardener, I used to go out with my poppy, and we would be raising our beans, and we could go hunting. We can't do that anymore. I got a story from I talked saying my family just had their store. They were all killed. Their throats were cut. They're not just leaving because they want to leave. How many of everybody just wants to get out of where their family and their home is? They're being forced out is what I'm, giving you a description of. The first thing I learned when I was 15 years old, went to Mexico. We lived in a place, and the first thing we learned was we had to pay the valedor, the people who guard the street, we had to pay them regularly, or our house would be robbed. That's many, many years ago. It's much, much, much worse. And one of the things that's interesting is to ask yourself, why is there so little knowledge of what goes on in Mexico? Why is this, every day I get a report on the Crimea, Syria, Iran. I don't get every day what's happening in Mexico. And this is all, they're coming from, this is happening in Guatemala, in El Salvador, all the way down Central America, Latin America. It's amazing. I'll give you how far this goes. When I was talking to you about the Kiki Camarena case, it was 85, his torture thing. They tortured him on a cassette because they were trying to find out how much he knew about the corruption inside the Mexican intelligence and police system, which was then at that time called the DFS. The guys in my embassy came to me with the recording. I couldn't listen to it. They're torturing a guy and keeping him alive. It's horrendous. And then later, there was an explosion in something we call a place called Cocovilla. An explosion went out in a whole block in a residential area in Lima. The police, who we knew were corrupt, didn't respond. The SWAT team responds. So when a SWAT team responds, they can't cover it up. We found the whole block was linked for manufacturing and servicing the narcotics. Then we found that the Mexican trade minister had a direct line to the Ministry of Interior. And it happened to be, I would go into the Ministry of Interior, the boss was there, the guy who had the direct line was his principal assistant. This boss, when he left office, went with suitcases of hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy a condo in Miami. The guy I just told you about, Garcia Luna, he goes out when Enrique Peña Nieto comes in. Guess where he's going and where he's living? Miami Beach. And you may even look at people talking to you about, wow, Miami's back. All the high rises are going. And everybody says, you know, it's sort of the capital of Latin America. You know, everybody went, who's buying those things? And we are thumb-sucking in the United States today. So part of it is knowing what your own agricultural ministry is. How many of you paid attention to what was going on with the money that was financing huge mega agricultural businesses that were flooding the markets in Mexico and destroying the livelihood of their peasant base? Did anybody know that here? I bet they didn't. And then you turn around and say, we're going to seal the border. And then we're going to make them miserable, and then we'll seal the border. Great.
It's very difficult for us to obtain information that's reliable. We don't really think that our media gives us a good picture. What would be your advice to us as to how to obtain better or to become better informed about the activities in Mexico and urging any of our politicians or however we can influence?
I guess part of it is if they begin to know from the public that you know some of these things and you want explanations, you can start writing to your congressmen and to senators. And I would say, you know, I'm concerned, you know, this immigration issue. You know, I don't have any problem with Mexicans. The ones I know are very nice people. But if I talk to them, they're saying to me, it's never been worse. Sometimes I don't dare go back. If you go back and it looks like you've got an American car, you're going to get robbed. You can't visit. Why? You know, I think part of the way we would, in a humane way, to address the immigration issue, which the American people are concerned about, say, why do we have all these illegals? It's not what Bush said, they love to come. That's not true. Who wants to leave where their families are, their cousins? These are extended family people. They all know that the morbida, the bite, that the payoff. I remember, I'll tell you, when I was in high school in Mexico, we had a guy who had a Jeep, I still remember. And he would drive down off the Paseo de la Reforma. He'd drive down the wrong way. And I said, what are you doing? He said, not to worry. Said, if anybody catches you, just give them some money. That's, and that, in comparison to now, that was peanuts. So I would say starting to show that you are concerned and that people do not, or you don't think you're getting the whole story about this, and you don't think that the people who are coming here are rushing to get out of their country just because they love the United States. The culture for many of them is not to love us. That's what I was describing. There's a lot of ingrained feelings of nationalist hostility to the United States in terms of its former taking of its territory, of its exploitation through its corporate interests in the country. So there's, you know, it's not, I can't wait to be an American.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
What about the demand side of this equation? I mean,
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Sorry, what about the demand side of this equation?
Demand?
And would legalization of drugs in this country have any impact at all?
Yes, it's wonderful. Once you have more and more marijuana, you're going to be in great shape because that's a gateway drug. So that will get us more narcotics, because that's why they're now growing more and more poppy in Mexico, because all the evidence shows that you need to get higher with more and more of a hit. That's why you go from snorting to injections and that sort of thing. So yes, we can certainly increase the demand and increase the capital flows to Mexico through the narcotics. So move ahead with legalization and really help the system substantially.
A surprising answer. Thank you very much, Professor Jordan. We really appreciate your information.